I know investors panic when a timeline gets pushed. How do you manage those expectations without sugarcoating it?
Nobody wants to hear bad news, but you have to do it, and we can't shy away from it.
So at Quantum, one question that keeps resurfacing is about redeployment and the sustainment period. If the sustainment period changes, how is that going to affect the current investors who have already been invested?
Our hope, and frankly my expectation, is that investors who have invested under the current policy will simply be grandfathered in. That, I think, is likely, but not certain.
So while some of the regional centers took it very positively, gave it to the investors, and they went about it, you actually stood against it and filed a lawsuit. So was there something that backed up this decision?
So when they do something like, triple the fee based on math, which they disclosed their calculations, quote unquote, which were completely based on totally incorrect information, we can't just let that go. We cannot allow them to sort of make things up.
What's the one behavior that you believe causes the most avoidable risk in this process?
Haste. I think that is probably the one thing.
So at Quantum, due diligence isn't just a buzzword for us. We look over proprietary checklist of over 45 questions, starting from regional centers track record, exit strategy, the time that the job is created and when does it get completed, and potential conflict of interest. And if it doesn't pass us, we do not move forward. It's as simple as that. By the end of it, we accumulated more than 90 questions. So thanks to you and the team for that.
Yes, our diligence process is extensive and we are very picky. We only end up investing in 2% or less of the opportunities that come across the desk, so we need to get it right.
Got it. This one helps for a lot of investors who are currently in the soup. This is actually something that I say to my investors also. Not everybody who's applying for an EB-5 is a millionaire. It's really hard-earned money, and people who are saving for their families.
Certainly, like I said, we've seen many investors, many clients over the years who have plenty of capital, but we've also seen many families who are pooling their resources to make something happen for their children that is life-changing.
The way, the emotion that Rishabh said it with, me and my team, we were only of that one thought, saying that this team actually cares about much more beyond money. It's about enriching lives. And that's one thing that has stayed with us.
What really made it fun, what really made it attractive was pooling capital from people who were looking to change their lives, as opposed to institutions like insurance companies and, other pensions, that kind of thing.
For the Hawaii project, we have collectively more than 95 questions. And honestly, kudos to your team. They were really patient enough and answered at the right time. And I think the numbers spoke for itself there. I think transparency and accountability.
That's the goal.
In a space where guarantees are impossible, what does integrity look like? So do you think the private equity side actually plays a larger role in these situations if they arise at Civitas?
Yes and no. It's important to understand that there's no side. It's just one team. It's the same people who are managing, whether it's an EB-5 investment or an insurance company, partner that we're investing with. So yes, it's like hardwired into our DNA. For years, early on, I used to tell EB-5 investors that we were an institutional quality firm, and I stopped doing that after Rafael finally told me, my colleague and co-founder, they don't know what you mean by that. They don't know what you mean when you're saying that. And it just hadn't occurred to me. I thought everyone knew what I was talking about, but they didn't.
Exactly.
So we had to start explaining, saying it in a different way that would have some meaning to people. But that's the shorthand. It's not that we're infallible. We've made plenty of mistakes, but we hold ourselves to that standard. And most of the time, that has worked well for us.
Great. So can we talk about the human side for a bit? I know investors panic when a timeline gets pushed. But how do you manage those expectations without sugarcoating it?
As we get to know each other better, you will learn something that my partners, my colleagues know about me, is that I kind of only have the one mode. And the mode is I am pretty straightforward with people. And sometimes I think can be difficult, for people to hear. I've been in the business of taking risk, managing risk, investing in a risk-based context for my whole career. And I'm good at absorbing changes as they come. I've learned, I've had to learn that most people are not. Most people need some more time to absorb. It's a blessing and a curse that I'm less emotional about these things than many. My wife would tell you that, I can, but there's a downside, I promise you. But in the investment business, it's mostly upside, because it helps me to be clear-eyed. It helps me to lead the team in a clear-eyed way.
It's a blessing in disguise.
It cuts both ways. It's literally, it's a blessing and a curse. The curse is, when we need to communicate that there's been a problem and here's what's happening, I'm not always the best messenger. I can explain what's happening, but often I will need to rely on a colleague who knows the investor, who knows a little bit about them and their personality and their background, to explain the words, the facts, that I or one of our investment folks might need to communicate. But everybody has different styles. So that has been a real challenge for me in my career, and it's something that we have frankly at times fallen short on. That I think now we've improved dramatically in the last 4 or 5 years as we've really focused on it. But it's a challenge. I mean, anytime you have to deliver bad news, nobody wants to hear bad news, but you have to do it.
Yeah. So being brutally honest is?
Try not to be brutal. You try to be just honest, and we also don't want to overstate it, because sometimes the unfortunate thing is that sometimes there's not certainty. Sometimes it's, this has happened and we're waiting to see, or we're taking this action and it depends on the next month, or depends on, some other factor that we can't predict today, but we need to tell you what's happening because we need to be transparent with you about what's happening. And that can be very unsatisfying, for an investor to hear, but that's our job, and we can't shy away from it.
But I think that's way more appreciated, right? Saying it as is.
And even when it's even when it's not anything anybody wants to hear, they definitely want to hear it rather than hear nothing, or rather than be lied to, or be misled about that something's being sugarcoated, because ultimately that just never helps.
Correct. Communication. So at Quantum, one question that keeps resurfacing, especially from folks who have been tracking EB-5 very closely, is about redeployment and the sustainment period. And we are not foreign to this right now, that there is a law case going on with respect to sustainment period, yes. And if it passes through, how is that going to affect the current investors who have already been invested? So if the sustainment period changes, how is it going to change?
Well, this is a good example of a situation where there is not certainty. The answer to that question is uncertain. It will depend on how the case proceeds. Right now, you may know, your viewers, listeners may know, I'm on the board of the trade association Invest in the USA, IUSA. And we have been, this case has been sort of paused for some months now while the government decides how they're going to respond to the judge's urging that they try to settle. So our hope is that there will be a settlement, and if there is a settlement, and where the case does not go to a decision by the judge, but rather there's a negotiated agreement, our hope, and frankly my expectation, is that investors who have invested under the current policy will simply be grandfathered in. That I think is likely, but not certain. There can be no promise or certainty that will happen that way. Similarly, if the case does go to the judge for a decision, she could rule that way. She could simply set the rule aside. I mean, there are a range of outcomes, and the timing is important, right? Because now we're talking about one of the things, for example, that the USCIS has told the court in this case is that they expect to issue a what's called an NPRM. It stands for Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. It's the first step in the formal regulatory process. So the Integrity Act today, it passed in 2022. We still do not have any regulations to implement the act at all. Okay, so they are way overdue issuing regulations, not just around the sustainment period, but around the whole law, right? The entire law. And they have said that as part of this case, they told the judge that they intend to issue the NPRM, the first step in the regulatory process, this year in I want to say September or October. I can't quite remember. If that happens, then we'll have a new, very important data point on what they want to do, right? So we're in, what is it, May?
Yeah.
Now that's not very long from now, right? So that's why the timing matters. So, it's not certain how that's going to play out, but I do expect, what is clear, in my opinion, is that as a process matter, the way that the government went about establishing the current sustainment period policy was illegal, was not allowed. They did not go through the formal notice and comment process that is clearly required by law. And one of the questions that I've gotten, is why are you challenging the sustainment period, as is? And it's important, very important, to understand that that is not all that's going on here. What we're challenging here is the process by which that sustainment period was promulgated by the service, which was very straightforward. They put it on their website. That's it. That's not how regulation works in the United States. You cannot make law by just posting it on your website, because investors have to understand, if they can just say on the website it's 2 years, they can also say it's 10 years. They can do whatever they want. And the point of this is they cannot do whatever they want. They have to go through the process that our law requires. So I think it's very likely now that when they do issue the regulation, the draft, there's going to be a healthy debate. There's going to be a lot of comment about how the sustainment period should work. And as we've made clear in our filings in the case, there's actually a pretty wide range of outcomes there. It's not a binary choice.
So it's very tricky to say right now until anything passes.
I would say it's uncertain is the word.
Got it. So the RIA has changed the game for EB-5, but most investors only understand it superficially. So from your seat, what is the biggest shift that you have seen pre and post RIA?
Well, there's a lot. Probably one of the most important things is just the cumulative effect of what are commonly referred to as the integrity measures in the Integrity Act, the RIA. There are, it did things like establish much higher standards for basic bona fides of people like me who operate regional centers. You can't be a felon. You can't, have had criminal conduct, that sort of thing. That wasn't there before. And it wasn't because anybody thought that was okay. They just hadn't thought about it back in 1991, or, when they were doing the first round of this legislation. So now those basics are in place, and that made a huge difference. I mean, it pushed a lot of people out of this market, literally,
Correct.
Made them ineligible, so that was very helpful, because the truth is, when I got started in this in 2008 and 9, at that time there had been fraud, that had been pretty high profile, in the mid 90s. And then as the EB-5 volume ramped up in the wake of the financial crisis, there were a whole series of, high profile, fraudulent, just outright thefts, and we can't have that. You can't have a program that is functional if that's happening, regularly. And I'm very pleased that, post Integrity Act, that's been pretty rare, and I don't think that's a coincidence. So that's, a very basic need that the program had that was met.
So that was post.
Yeah.
Got it. So Civitas has also taken a legal action recently. You sued the USCIS over what you called an astounding fee hike.
Oh, yes. Yes. Truly astounding.
So while some of the regional centers took it very positively, gave it to the investors, and they went about it, you actually stood against it and filed a lawsuit. So was there something that backed up this decision?
Absolutely. This actually, there's two things going on here. One is the process, again, by which the service, implemented these fees was incorrect. So, and it's very important that we hold the service, the USCIS, accountable for following the law, for following the correct processes, because if we don't, whatever they do improperly becomes the rule. A great example of this is one of the biggest, problems or mistakes that the industry made was back in the early 1990s, at the very beginning of EB-5, when the first law was passed. The State Department interpreted the law to say not 10,000 investors, but 10,000 visas. And so they, count against the 10,000 annual allocation the spouses and children of each primary investor, which means that the program's capacity is about a third of what it would otherwise be. That's not in the law. The law doesn't say that. The State Department made that up in the early 1990s by interpreting it that way. No one said anything. So that became the law. When we finally realized what a big problem that was, 20 plus years later, and filed the lawsuit, the judge said, you're probably right, but you waited too long, essentially, right? So when they do something like, triple the fee based on math, which they disclosed their calculations, quote unquote, which were completely, based on totally incorrect information, we can't just let that go. We're talking about material amounts of money in fees, for many investors, for us as a firm. But just as important, we're talking about a principle. We cannot allow, them to sort of make things up based on, data that's not real.
Correct. But I'll be honest, most of the regional centers would actually shy away from this. Yes, we obviously have to pick our battles. There are many things that we object to, or, that we think that, they may do wrong as a policy or in a particular case, and we don't sue them every time. We sue them when we think they're doing something that is particularly egregious, as in this case with the fees, because it has no bearing to the actual costs that they need to cover. And it's also in direct contravention of the language of the statute. And when there's, it's particularly bad when there's also a process problem. When you combine those things, that's when, and I will say, we took the lead on this, but we're not alone in it. We have peers, colleagues, and the association itself, is also involved, and, that's important. Got it. So what does your redeployment strategy looks like?
Well, so right now, our redeployment strategy is generally to avoid it. So most of our investments are structured with a primary term that is designed to roughly approximate, when we estimate that most of our investors will be eligible, to receive their capital back based on the current sustainment policy. But that could change. The policy could change. The time frame could change. Things happen. So if we do have to redeploy capital, our general approach is that we seek out investments that are of approximately the same equivalent risk profile as the original investment, or less, and we go back to investors and, explain to them what the project is and ask them if they want to do it. We always have that option, have that point where they can make a decision. In some cases, we have been able to structure short-term bridge investments, for example, when we've had cases where, capital needs to be redeployed, but only for, 6 months or a year, relatively short term. We've been able to accommodate that. Sometimes we haven't. That's when, we have to use our judgment about protecting everyone's immigration status, versus, a single or a group of, a few investors. And that can be tough. But, for the most part, I found that the alignment has not been that difficult to achieve.
Got it. But investors do not have a say in this, right? In case if it hits a redeployment.
They do, in the sense that we will not just redeploy their money. If they want to withdraw, they can. We will tell them, if our judgment is that you're not eligible, you're taking immigration risk by withdrawing, they'll need to sign a release, a piece of paper that acknowledges that. But they have that option.
Got it. All right. So if the sustainment period lawsuit succeeds, do you think EB-5 program will become more popular or less, and why?
I think it depends on what succeeds means. Because there's more than one possible outcome. But overall, stepping back from that, I actually don't think it's going to have that much of an effect on demand one way or another. I think that if the outcome is that for a period of time, we go back to the old sustainment policy, then that's going to be for a limited period of time in any event, because there's going to be new regulations that will be issued. And it's quite possible that the new regulations will simply formally and correctly, promulgate today's policy. So I don't think it's going to have a huge effect as a practical matter one way or another. I also think that it's going to make redeployment policy and redeployment transparency more important, obviously, if redeployment becomes more relevant. But that's okay. I think the market knows how to deal with that now. When redeployment was a new concept and, regional centers were sort of winging it, in figuring out how to implement it, that was one thing. But that's not the world we're living in anymore.
Correct. But what if the current sustainment period is 2 years? And what if it increases to 5 or more? As an investor, it becomes the lock-in period is much more longer, right?
Not necessarily, because the sustainment period being 2 years, it's very important to be specific about what we're talking about here, because it's 2 years from when, right?
Okay.
So when the 2-year clock starts is not at all clear. That is not clear in USCIS's current policy. That's one of the reasons why we wanted them to go through the notice and comment process so that we can clarify what the policy actually is. In reality, most immigration lawyers would tell you that the 2-year clock is going to start the day that the very last EB-5 dollar goes into the project, right? So if you have, let's say a 2-year draw schedule, then you have 2 years, you're talking about a 4-year sustainment period, which is how we roughly size our most recent loan, for example. That's not very, very different from the proposal that IUSA made, which would be a much clearer 5-year period, but that has a clear start date, where you don't have this contingent start date, because that's much more transparent for investors, So what we don't know is exactly how that's going to shake out once the real regulations are finally promulgated. We don't know how that's going to go exactly. But no matter what we do know is that the outcome of this lawsuit is a temporary outcome, because it is going to be superseded by regulation no matter what.
Correct. Got it. So we often say EB-5 isn't just a residency plan, but an emotional one.
Sure.
So what steps does Civitas take to ensure capital preservation plus the emotional side of the investors?
Well, often that boils down to communication. It's a cliche that every problem is a communication problem. But in this context, it's pretty accurate. In terms of capital preservation, I'm a credit guy. That's how I think, is in terms of downside risk mitigation. So we've talked about all of the structuring and process that we, go through on the front end to hopefully, put us in a position where if there's an unexpected problem or a cost overrun, we've thought ahead about how that's going to be handled and mitigated that risk to the extent that it's possible. That's our job. from an investment management perspective. That's the standard. That when I talk about institutional quality, that's the standard that I'm referring to. But when it comes to managing the relationship and the process and the sort of interaction between the management of the investment and the actual immigration process, that's a communication exercise, because the investor is relying on experts, relying on their immigration lawyer to help them understand. They're relying on us to help them manage the investment that they've made. And given that that's the case, the way that we do our best, I can't say that we're 100% successful, but we do our best to keep people informed and to be accessible, when they have questions. And because your quarterly report is only going to answer so many questions. There are going to be details, there are going to be special circumstances, and we have to be very sensitive to that because, like you said, this is an investment, but it's also a life-changing process, and people are, going to expect, rightfully so, that we're available, to help, even if it's a little bit outside the line of, loan maintenance or whatever.
Got it. So, is it safe to say that the capital preservation for Civitas has not changed over the last 25 years, and has it been the same? I would rephrase last 20 years. Has it been
in terms of our approach to it, that has been consistent. We have always prioritized that. Now, sometimes, rarely, we will make an equity investment, for example. Obviously, it's inherently the case that, if you're making an equity investment and trying to earn equity-like returns, then you're inherently going to take more risk, and that's fine. That's as long as everyone knows that going in, eyes open. But as a general matter, the vast majority of what we do is debt. It's in the form of loans, and they're designed, not to maximize returns, but rather to mitigate risk and to preserve capital.
So, but investors also look for a clear path and modest returns.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you protect both of it in case of an equity?
In case of an equity investment?
Yeah, because debt, we know that the returns are very minimal.
In our case, with Civitas, with equity investments, that's not the case. Because we rarely offer equity investment opportunities. It's not what we do very often. But when we do, they have, market or very close to market equity returns. So the investor is taking more risk inherently, but they're being compensated for that risk. And that's the idea. We have certainly seen in the past many, it's much less common now post-Integrity Act, but even, occasionally now we will see equity investments that have materially below market returns associated with them. And that's just not our model. We just don't do that because in my mind, there's really no reason for an investor to take that financial risk if they're not being paid because they can get the immigration benefit without taking that risk. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. If you're going to take equity risk, there should be a commensurate return.
Correct. Got it. So the elephant in the room for a lot of serious investors is what happens if the regional center, the developer, are hand-to-hand? What happens to the conflict of interest?
This is very important. So there are three roles here.
Fund manager.
Right. So you can have a separate developer and fund manager or investment manager. So our standard model, our typical offering, Civitas is in the regional center role and is in the investment manager or fund manager role, right? Where we're pooling capital and we're into a partnership, and that partnership is making a loan to a third party, to a developer that's building a building. There, you really don't have much of a conflict issue at all. I mean, of course, there are, all of the standard conflicts that are possible. But it's different when you have a vertically integrated regional center that's also a developer. When you have a situation where there's a loan, where a developer is essentially making a loan to themselves, I won't say that can't be done correctly because conflicts can be disclosed, they can be structured around. There are ways to do that, and we have done that in the past. I mean, from time to time, that we've had structures where that's been the case. But as a general matter, if that is the case, you have to look at that very closely. Because if there's a misalignment, if there's a problem, it could have a serious consequence, which is a risk you don't really have to take, typically. So particularly today.
So what role does SEC play in case of a conflict of interest?
The rules around the securities laws that govern these offerings, many of them are the same, regardless of whether any of the parties are directly registered or not. They still apply either way. So you have all of the rules around disclosure of conflicts, disclosure of fees, all of those things apply in the registered context and not. So that's the first thing to understand. The regulator's primary role is not to pass judgment or evaluate the merits, or whether a particular offering is compliant with the law or not. That they don't really do that. Their job is, when in the regulated context, they obviously have, we have periodic audits or reviews, they come in, but they're looking for our compliance at the firm level. They're not evaluating each offering as they happen. Okay. So that's not the role of the regulator. So what the registration matters for is some of the heightened requirements around record keeping and transparency and marketing and disclosure that apply in a registered context that are a higher standard. But for stuff like this, for conflicts of interest, these always have to be disclosed. And if they're not, the regulator may catch it after the fact, but by then it's too late. So that's why it's so important to have, the right advisors helping to look at these, potential investments on the front end, because the regulator is not going to help you with that.
Correct. So do you actually see investors asking all of these questions, or are they just focused on the returns and timely reporting?
I would say that in, the 15, going on 16 years that I've been doing this, at the beginning, we heard almost none of this. It was very rare. The market has evolved and matured quite a lot in that time frame. Unfortunately, in some cases, because of the bad experience, learning from the bad experience that investors themselves or people they know, or have read about have had. And now we get a lot more questions. We don't get typically what I would call institutional level inquiries or diligence very often, but we do get it now. So it's not never. It's more common now for investors to hire financial advisors or accountants or very experienced attorneys who may bring in others to look at our documents, to come visit us, to do some of the things that we're more used to seeing in the kind of private equity institutional context. It's not to that level yet, but it's much better than it was.
Got it. I'm asking this because we find ourselves at Quantum educating the investors after they have signed the term sheets elsewhere. And I think it's just a missed opportunity in that case.
I suspect that's often true. I suspect that is often true. There are, you can only do what you can do, but better late than never.
Correct. So finally, what's the one behavior that you believe causes the most avoidable risk in this process?
Haste, hurrying. I think that is probably the one thing. When we, to your point about seeing, getting to talk to someone after they've made a commitment, it may not be too late for everything, but it's too late to do a lot at that point. This is similar. We don't find that investors these days, especially if they're advised by someone, they're not just meeting me or meeting one of my team members and just signing up. They're talking to a lot of people, and they should. It's a major commitment. But when there's time pressure, you asked me about, sometimes there's an age out or some kind of, that's when there can be, risk or missed opportunities to kind of evaluate risk that would be better to avoid.
Got it. So at Quantum, due diligence isn't just a buzzword for us. We look over proprietary checklist of over 45 questions, starting from regional centers track record, exit strategy, the time that the job is created and when does it get completed, and potential conflict of interest. And if it doesn't passes, we do not move forward. It's as simple as that. And when we were looking at the Hawaii project, we did an extensive due diligence.
You did.
And your team was very well aware because they were really patient with us. By the end of it, we accumulated more than 90 questions. Mm-hmm. So thanks to you and the team for that.
Absolutely. Happy to do it.
So coming to the due diligence part, do you also do a complete due diligence for every project that you take? And if it doesn't work out, how do you approach it?
Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, that really is what a huge component of what our investors are paying us to do, is to do the work on the front end and bring them something that is fully vetted. The Hawaii, project is a good example. Hawaii is a unique market in the United States. There's no other state that has its unique requirements in a range of areas, environmental, all kinds of things. It's also a particularly high barrier market. It's difficult to build there, both physically and because of regulation, entitlements, other rules. One of the areas that we ended up spending about 3 months on was just the insurance, for this project. Without going into anything confidential, we really insisted that the structure of the insurance coverage be revised in a way that would be more advantageous, that would mitigate more risk for us as the lender and ultimately for our EB-5 investors in certain circumstances. And that's not something that, to be frank, I think most people in this business even understand, let alone, spend a lot of time on, let alone spend 3 months on, something I'm very proud of. So yes, our diligence process is extensive, and we are very picky. We only end up investing in 2% or less of the opportunities that come across the desk. So we need to get it right.
Got it. So Hawaii project is one of the most very interesting project because one of my investors told me even if he wasn't an EB-5 investor, he would any which ways go through by investing in that project.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm glad to hear it. One of the things that I'm very proud of is that one of the investors in this offering, in this project, is a very senior person at the hotel investment arm of a major global real estate firm. So this is someone who knows exactly what he is looking at, exactly. And I can tell you that his questions were detailed, and I'm proud that we passed that test, but I'm not surprised.
That's great. So here's a thought. So when you are balancing so many moving parts, job creation, the developer's track record, let it be with respect to compliance, how do you manage all of it with respect to a particular project when you are looking at it on a wider angle of a regional center?
In terms of making kind of a go, no-go decision, we have a process that is standardized. We score projects on 5 general areas, and they have to score a minimum in the first round, the first kind of initial application for us to even spend any additional time on it. For those that do, we'll then dig into each of these areas. What happens sometimes, where the challenge here can come up is where we really like a project, we really like, 4 out of the 5 things, but there's a weakness, and we ask ourselves, is there a way to, work with the developer to address this weakness? Maybe the weakness is the developer is very experienced generally, but they're not experienced in this particular rural market. It's their first time doing a rural project in this area, as an example. Like, depending on the circumstance, that might or might not, rise to the level of a weakness that would, cause us to pass on the opportunity. One of the things that I actually drive my colleagues crazy is that we have a core value at Civitas that's focused creativity. And before this value replaced a previous core value that was relentless creativity, which was something I wrote, something I was very attached to emotionally. And after some years, my colleagues convinced me that we needed to revise it because the relentless was too much. It put too much emphasis on applying creativity to solve problems. And sometimes the right thing to do is just walk away from a problem, So this focused creativity was our, really a considered effort to revise that to more accurately reflect how we actually operate. And this is a great example because I am the get to yes guy. I am very solution oriented. If I like something and I think that a problem could be solved, my base instinct is to try to solve it. My colleague Jonathan, who now runs our investment team, some of us call him Dr. No. If there's a problem, he would rather find another opportunity that doesn't have that problem. And it's just a different way. And we often butt heads, but when we end up agreeing that we should move forward on something, if it can meet his standards and mine and the rest of our teams, it's probably a pretty good deal.
So what's the one thing on top of your mind that you think that investors should look at, which can be more like a deal breaker?
Oh, the one thing that meaning something that they should never do?
Yes.
Or
something rather they should be looking at. And if that is not there, then it's a deal breaker and move out.
The first thing that comes to mind is experience. At this point in the evolution, the development of the EB-5 market, no investor needs to be anybody's guinea pig. We obviously want to serve everyone. We think we're the best. We think we're great. But if it's not us, make sure it's a peer of ours that knows what they're doing. There's really no substitute for experience.
Got it. So one of the things that we actually see in our space is that the investors make decisions based on their emotional capabilities sometimes. Because like we were discussing, the H1 and F1B cases, in those cases, what is the bigger long-term picture in your experience is something that it's a common mistake that you see in investors.
Well, one thing I would say is that, it's human nature to be more comfortable with something that you're more familiar with. And so, for example, we've had investors who would say to us, I'd rather invest in a project in California just because I've been there, and I have family there, or I have some basic sense of it, as opposed to something in Texas or where that they're not as familiar with. And in this context, in the EB-5 context, that instinct is often not helpful. Because it can result in sort of biasing an investor against an opportunity that may well be better, if they have the right advisor, if they have the right resource who can help them compare the things that are really important, and not necessarily make the decision on, something that just sort of at a gut level feels a little more familiar. We see that regularly. Especially when we were starting, and for the first 2 years we were solely focused on doing investments that were in Dallas, and then we've always had a major presence in Texas. And there are many investors around the world who just aren't as familiar with Texas as they are with New York City or with San Francisco. And I'm originally from New York. I love New York, but it's not the only good place to invest. Texas has a lot of, things to recommend it. And if you take the time to make those comparisons based on, what, in my humble, opinion is, the most important elements of an EB-5 investment, it can uncover, opportunities, insights, that initial kind of gut reaction can often, prompt you to miss.
So what's one question that investors should ask but has never asked you?
That if they've never asked me, well, I don't know that an investor has ever asked me, what do you mean by institutional quality? I mentioned earlier, I used to describe ourselves, I used to describe Civitas and our process that way, and it was a total failure of communication. So, Ideally, I mean, if there were a way, if I could get investors to focus on the elements of that concept that make us different, I would try to do that. But I haven't quite figured out how to get it all into one little phrase like that works in the EB-5 context. But that's why, frankly, that the quantum and advisors that know what they're doing are really very important in this space.
Got it. So I remember we were discussing about HUA and rural projects and why there are very fewer rural projects compared to HUA in the market. So if you can throw some light on that.
Sure. I think, part of it just starts with the size of the markets. The amount of investment and development opportunity and sort of business activity, economic activity generally that is happening in urban America is vastly larger. It's just vastly more than what is happening in rural America. That's the primary reason, that the Congress, saw fit to create an additional incentive to encourage investment in rural areas, job creation in rural areas, because it's more difficult as a general matter. So that's sort of full stop. That's the main reason, that you see the difference, because it's just a lot harder to originate anything in a rural area as a general matter. Second, from our perspective as an investment manager, we're looking for projects, whether they're urban or rural, that have enough scale to make sense, that have enough job creation, obviously to meet the requirements, but, also to exceed them and, have the right, risk profile from an immigration perspective. So that narrows the funnel even more. So you just, it's easy or much easier to get down to a pretty thin universe in the rural origination process than in the urban one. I mean, we could invest billions of dollars in loans and investments in real estate developments if we were, nationally in the United States, it would not be difficult to originate. But with rural, it's a much harder. It's a much bigger challenge.
Understood. So do you invest in hospitality majorly compared to other investments, or do you have a preference in that?
No, we're not solely. We have two main real estate property types that we tend to focus on. The first is residential, so multifamily apartments, also for sale housing. This can be condominiums or homes. And the other is hospitality. So those are our two main areas. We will occasionally invest in other areas as well, all in commercial real estate. But like, for example, we have done mixed use retail in the past, or the occasional other type of property. But multifamily and hotels are our kind of bread and butter.
So what's the thesis for your new project selection?
So, starting off, the first thing that we're always looking for is, the first screen is always EB-5 compliance. We want to start with, is this, if this project is as advertised, if we just assume initially that everything is, what the sponsor says it's going to be, is it going to meet the requirements? What does the profile look like? So that's what we're comparing first. And then, from that universe, then it's an opportunity cost, process. We're looking at the size and efficiency. We're looking at, obviously, the economic returns and, how strong the relative risk is, from a lending perspective, what the credit profile looks like. And we're comparing. So at any given time, every project in our pipeline is sort of competing with every other project, because we can't do them all. Even the ones that we would like to do them all, we can't, because we just don't have enough time or capacity.
Got it. So how much of your own capital do you typically invest in these projects? I ask this because investors feel more confident when they know the regional center is also putting in their own money.
So this depends on the type of project. When we make equity investments, we invest alongside our investors. That is typical in the equity context outside of EB-5. Just in the investment world generally. In the debt context, we don't always. The reason for that is that our loan investments are structured specifically for EB-5 investors. They're structured specifically to meet those requirements, and that generally means a trade-off where the return on the investment, is below market. That's part of why a sponsor, would want to borrow money from Civitas as opposed to from JP Morgan or, some other, source, is the relatively lower cost. So in that context, it doesn't make as much sense for us to do because we don't have that motivation. So that's kind of the difference.
Got it. Thank you for sharing this. This is actually a big one for trust for investors.
Sure.
So you've been in this for over a decade. And what do you think is the best time to invest in EB-5 given the recent circumstances?
Well, the president of the United States has, made his announcement about the gold card. There's some degree of uncertainty about what may happen with EB-5. I remain very confident that the program is going to continue and that it'll be reauthorized, in 2027 when it comes up. We're working very hard on that as a firm and through the association. But having said that, things do happen. We've seen this, some volatility in this. So if you're considering investing, you're considering pursuing the EB-5 route, sooner is better than later. Because there's a lot of demand and there is a limited supply of, by statute, and there's a limited supply of good projects.
This one helps for a lot of investors who are currently in the soup.
Well, I hope so.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dan, for your invaluable time and this great insights, because a lot of listeners who are listening to it today have gained a lot of knowledge from you.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
And thank you so much to Fritz.
I've enjoyed getting to know Fritz. This is going to be my daughter's favorite part of this interview.
Thank you so much. So if you have stayed till the end, thank you. My goal at Quantum Global has always been simple: to cut through the noise and give you the consideration EB-5 wants and be your one point of contact for all things EB-5. If you want to reach out, please drop in a comment and we will get to you.